Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on your location. We want to welcome you again to our discussion in First Corinthians. We have been, for the last few weeks, studying from First Corinthians chapter 11. Last week, our discussion focused somewhat on the first and second areas of importance in this chapter. One, what it means to follow one as they follow Christ, and we talked about that pretty extensively. And second, we discussed the covering as it relates to worship, along with the general discussion concerning dress. This week, we will be looking at another section of the scriptures that is given to really unneeded controversy, but it is quite a bit of controversy surrounding the issue of the Lord's Supper and more specifically, eating in the building. In these verses under discussion, Paul seems to show really an utter disgust with the way that the Corinthians have approached this particular communion. I'd like to read from 1 Corinthians chapter 11, beginning with verse 17. We'll likely cover down through verse 21 or 22 today. Now in this that I declare unto you, I praise you not, that ye come together not for the better, but for the worse. Well, first of all, when you come together in the church, I hear that there be divisions among you, and I partly believe it. For there must be also heresies among you, that they which are approved may be made manifest among you. When you come together, therefore, in one place, this is not to eat the Lord's Supper. For in eating everyone taketh before other his own supper, and one is hungry and another is drunken. What? Have ye not houses to eat and drink in, or despise ye the church of God, and shame them that have not? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I praise you not. In reading this, of course, there are a number of things that we are so aware of. The fact that perhaps during the first century, the church buildings were maybe slightly different than they are today. Maybe they didn't have all of the refinements that we have, the bathrooms, they didn't have the drinking fountains, they didn't have the places where people could sit down and eat. It was just quite a mess with the church buildings, the early church buildings at that time, and this is a problem that seems to be causing such a problem with us today. Now when I'm joking, of course, I thought I'd throw this in to say I'm joking, because we know that they did not have church buildings in the first century. The church generally met in homes. And when we look at the situation that is being discussed here, especially, Paul explains with enormous clarity, I think, that the problems of which he now speaks occurring in the assemblies, and he's speaking about the things that have come to his own ears, and summarizes this in really, I think, when he says that there are schisms or cliques that exist among you. And we'll talk about that a little bit. Paul, he says, and I partly believe it. He probably doesn't want to believe some of what he's been hearing. And again, these problems are problems that are beginning to rise up, as we said last week, after Paul left. These weren't problems that were occurring while he was there. But there are those now who are creating problems. And Paul writes that those approved may become manifest upon you, among you. It should be obvious who is sound in these matters. Paul says that a situation like this really makes it impossible to eat the Lord's Supper. And I think in my view of this, he's talking about the gravity of the problem. But let's look at this in a number of ways. One, people have seemed to come to a number of different points of view as to what Paul is talking about. Some have viewed this as a situation that occurs really before the assembly takes place, whereby as a result of this problem with their eating the food, that it just makes eating the Lord's Supper impossible. Some have seen this as a problem within the distribution of the supper itself. But the larger ball of wax that has really come out of this, and what we have been told that we should learn from this more than anything else, Michael, is that we have our own homes to eat in, and that we should not be eating anywhere near the building so that we can avoid these problems. Is that not the argument that's made? What is the basis for that argument in reality? And why does it continue to consume so many people today? Now, before you answer, last year I was in a meeting in Fish Hatchery, and Fish Hatchery is a congregation just north of Houston, about 40, 50 miles north of Houston. Not very far also from the Spring Church of Christ, which is just outside of Houston. Two congregations that work in fellowship very well together. But I was at Fish Hatchery for a meeting, and after one of the lessons, a gentleman came up, and the first thing he wanted to know was why we had, now, of course, Fish Hatchery has a building that is not, that's not even, well, it's sort of attached to the main auditorium, but it's not the main auditorium. It's not that dissimilar from where you are, Michael. And he said he simply could not concentrate on the lesson because he knew that food was in another building that was owned by the church. I had such a hard time dignifying a response, but it does give us an indication of the wide horizontal and breadth, but also the depth of misinterpretation, misrepresentation of Scripture. Does it not, Michael?
Yes, it does. I wonder if he would have been able to concentrate on the worship if during the first century he was meeting with the brethren that met in homes. Knowing that there's food right over there, there's a kitchen there in someone's home, and they're going to be eating there, before too long. I wonder if he would have been able to worship in that situation, or if he would have had to leave and go someplace else.
Well, of course, logically, he would not be able to worship in the homes in the first century with the church.
Yeah, that's the point. And yet that's the way in which a lot of congregations where they met. There's two avenues into which this thinking goes. One of them is, and it comes from the old, the building is some type of a sanctuary,
a temple,
and you can't desecrate that building because it's the temple of God, and they don't understand that really the temple is the church, not some building. There's a second avenue which comes from this, where you have houses to eat in, and thus you shouldn't eat in the building. I wonder if they ever go out to eat. What I would like to do to those individuals is go to their favorite, whatever they love to eat. Go to a place that serves that's the best place. Let them order their favorite food, and then say, surely you're not going to eat that because you're got your home to eat in. Why? If it's one place, it's another. They've got their homes to eat in. Thus, they need to be eating at home, not going out to eat. Of course, they're not going to apply it in that way. The third avenue, and I guess of the three, I probably respect this one the most, even though it's, again, misguided, is that you should not spend church funds on those things. And really, that goes down to the aspect of expediency. Is it expedient to spend money on a building that can also uh, serve to eat in? Uh, what if you're using it also for classes?
We do.
Yeah, y'all's is. Is it right then, but wrong if it's not used for classes? A lot of it becomes a matter of expediency, um, and also emphasis.
Oh,
Uh,
before, can I interrupt for a second? Let me ask Sonny what the experience is in the UK because I'm not exactly sure of what the general overview is in the UK. It's not, I mean, this is a very deeply ingrained view among some brethren in the United States. Very deeply ingrained. What about over in the UK, Sonny?
I've not personally encountered anyone in the UK who has a problem with that. Uh, well, the church at the point meets in my office, and we have our fellowship lunch in my office. So I guess it's safe, isn't it? It's not in the house. It's not in the church building.
Uh,
Well,
and
we have never met in the church building because at the point never had a church building. It's always in my office. So I don't
well,
suppose that we would
I
preach
do know that
the scriptures.
at Stratford, where they rent a place,
Mm.
they Leightonshire. I can't remember the exact place.
Basingstoke.
Yes, that's it. That's it. But I know that they have the place that they rent is also has the accommodation for food uh, and again, I just wondered if it was something that was a deeply held view in the UK. I'm guessing that it must not be, but certainly in the States, you really encounter people, and as Michael was pointing out, you encounter people who have uh, those different nuances of views. The latter view is one that generally is more consistent with the group that will refuse to use church funds for anything,
right.
uh, and they are more consistent along those lines. Uh,
They try to
those
be.
they try, well, yeah, they try to be, uh, but they will still have water fountains and they will have bathrooms and they will have those other things, but so hence the inconsistency there. But
Yeah,
it is a
if you can drink in the building, drink water in the building, why can't you eat in the building?
Well, they in many instances they will allow and accept the preacher coming to eat his lunch in the building.
I know some who would oppose that even. I've
But
met some.
the basis for this, Michael, as you say, goes back. The gentleman that I was speaking with, his foundation came out from the Old Testament temple,
Yeah,
and God not authorizing eating and that sort of thing.
right.
But it was really amazing to hear his answer uh, to some of the questions that were raised regarding that view. And then when he said, "Well, I just sitting here listening to you, I couldn't concentrate because I knew food was over in the other building." I
My
said,
response
"Well,
to that it would be, that's your problem.
exactly." I said, "Well, I was
You, you,
thinking the very same thing when I saw a building that had French doors. I just can't keep my mind off."
uh, Johnny.
Yes.
I wonder what Eutychus in Acts 20 was thinking while Paul was preaching. I wonder if he was thinking about the bed in the house when he fell out the window. He just
it,
could not
it's just
concentrate, isn't it?
it's just difficult to it really is difficult to and reasoning. I think the more um, frustrating aspect of this is that when you uh, are discussing it with someone who holds that view, that the unwillingness to listen to the logic or illogic of that particular view is what's more frustrating. If you lay out the varying points that are so easy to really ascertain and understand, yet without exception, in my experience, they are completely unwilling to move off of that position. It's one of the really rare, well, maybe not so rare, but it's really one of the things where you can see it's such an easy explanation for it, but they are simply unwilling to accept it. Is that your experience, Michael? Oh, I'm
It
sorry.
is. And let me mention one thing. I mentioned the idea of emphasis. Um, I know years ago in discussing it with an individual, he mentioned a congregation there in town who, at the time when they built their building, they built a kitchen and facilities for the kitchen that really any restaurant in town would have been envious of. It was that well decked out. There can be an overemphasis of certain things,
Mhm.
and that might have been a case in that situation. Um, and so you have to be careful about dealing with emphasis in those things, even though the principle
Mhm.
might still be true. Um, and I say at that time because that's one of the richest areas in Texas. Uh, and so lots changed in those years. But at that time, when they built their building, the kitchen that they built was just an amazing situation.
Hmm.
So there is that aspect, and some people worry about that. But the abuse, in that case, I would say abuse, does not negate the right. In fact, if you don't have the right, you cannot abuse it.
You can't, yeah, right.
Um, but he went beyond that. He would not even, from the standpoint of a preacher bringing in his lunch, he would object to that. Um, so he went the total aspect. I mean, but
Just,
but yet they had a water fountain in their building.
and did they allow mothers to nurse their children?
Uh, I don't know. They probably
You,
at
you know,
that time they
Michael,
probably didn't have that problem.
Michael,
Yes.
have you ever got an explanation in Acts 20? How did they explain that? That Eutychus, the scripture says that after having, fallen off the building and taken up dead, and Paul rose him up, and the scripture actually said in verse Acts 20:11 that now when he had come up and had broken bread and
Mhm.
eaten and talked
Mhm.
a long while even till daybreak, he departed. So have you got any response to that itself, that Paul was eating in the building?
I raised that same point, and no, I did not.
You don't get a response in those regards. Of course, those who would say you would have those who, the first group that I mentioned that, or one group that I mentioned that say it just eating in the building because the building's holy and things like that, they won't answer.
Mhm.
Those who, there's the other group who say, well, you don't spend money on out of the church funds out of that. They would say, well, sure, that eating in homes and things like that, but that's not taking the money out of the church treasury and spending money on those things. And that's the way they would answer it.
So I guess those people have to be pretty confined. You couldn't really have a like they have during the summers and other times of the year when people will have um, camps. And maybe on Sunday at the camp, whether it's at wherever it is, they'll have a worship service. But I guess you couldn't really have a worship service at an outdoor camp if you had food anywhere in the vicinity.
Again, you're dealing with different arguments. Those who would be saying you can't take funds out of the church treasury, that would be okay, even though they wouldn't do it. They would be opposed to it, even though in principle what they're saying does not oppose it. Those who say it's the building and have that holy attitude, I think all of them have that basic attitude that something is holy about the building, even though they don't really approach it from that standpoint.
But Michael, let's look at that just briefly. In assigning holiness to the building, one, no idea where that came from, but were the homes holy in the first century?
They don't really think about that. And that's why generally they'll jump around from argument to argument. They won't stick with one argument. If you start answering one, they'll jump to something else.
Well, you would think that a person would learn from that there is a fallacy in the argument. The premise is incorrect.
Yeah, but kind of like you're talking to that guy at Fish Etchery Road, you can't reason with them. They've got their thought. This is it. Doesn't matter what you say, what you do, or anything else. That's it.
Well, let's backpedal a little bit on that. I think not only does it seemingly, it doesn't, of course, it shouldn't matter what I say, but going back to what Sonny pointed out, it doesn't even matter what the Bible makes pretty explicit.
No. And of course, the idea of the building being holy basically comes from your old denominational and Roman Catholic.
Well, that's so true, and that's what is really sad about that. But when you ask that question, and when you see the situation there where it's clear that Paul is eating where they had the worship. I mean, there's really, you cannot get around that no matter how you try. And that is as clear an example in terms of an argument against it that you can make. And yet, it's almost the embrace of a denominational mindset.
The other argument I've really never heard responded to too much is the love feast of the first century. It's mentioned in 2 Peter 2 and Jude. I mean, that was a time in which the brethren together were eating together. So I say I've never really gotten a response to that either.
Well, okay. Let's look at the situation again in Corinth, and let's look at what Paul is saying to these brethren. Let's look at the text itself. He says, of course, since you come together, not for the better, but for the worse. For first of all, when you come together as the church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and in part I believe it. There must also be factions among you, that those who are approved may be recognized among you. Therefore, when you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. I'll stop right there. Because I've heard two different views as to exactly what this means. For in eating, one takes his own supper ahead of others. One is hungry and another is drunk. What, do you not have houses, but that portion there before, and I've heard the different views. One, that this is something that takes place before the actual worship, and it gets so out of hand that they can't even have the mindset, the proper mindset to worship. Others that this is occurring during the worship. Have you heard varying views like that, Michael?
Not really. I haven't really heard that many views about this.
Oh, really? Just one view?
Uh, Hadn't gotten into that many discussions about it actually.
So, in interpreting this, are you seeing this as something that happens prior to the partaking of the supper, or is this something that's going on as an ongoing situation while the supper is being administered?
I thought that back and forth on that. I'm really not positive. At times, I think it's more from the standpoint of something separate, like the love feast,
Mm-hmm.
and the divisions were there, which prevented them from worshiping acceptably.
That's the view that I've sort of landed on in terms of going back and looking at this over and over.
Kind of the view that I take. Yeah, at times I see that it was actually during the Lord's Supper that they were abusing, but it doesn't seem to fit within the entirety of the context.
Well, and in the translation itself, it's more along the lines of when you come together, it's impossible for you to eat the Lord's Supper because of the way that you've been acting. The action of the members made that particular celebration, or not celebration, made that particular the gravity of that communal action impossible. And I think that seems to be what he's addressing. You can't even eat the Lord's Supper because you're more consumed with your own individual meals and stuff before any of this takes place. It again points to and seems to be in line with the kinds of problems that were pandemic in Corinth to begin with. They seem to be arguing about everything. Go ahead.
I was just going to mention either way that you take this, it's not going to really affect
No,
what
it's not a doctrinal, right?
and the problems that were there.
Sonny, any thought or comment on this? He may not have heard me.
He's got his mic muted.
I see. And another thing. Oh, there he is. Sonny, any thoughts on this?
I think that it has reference to the love feast, basically that was supposed to take place in the before the service itself. The term supper, the term supper in the original language denotes an evening meal. So obviously that Paul was referring to an evening meal where the brethren got together and they had, like today we have the fellowship lunches or whatever you want to call them, we get together to eat, but we eat it after the worship service. I think that has to do with the love feast itself.
That's the answer. That's the answer. You have to have these meals after the worship, because if you have them before the worship, people start fighting.
It's true as well. But I think that the point that Paul is trying to make is basically that the division was the cause of the problem itself. Mm-hmm. And he said that there was division amongst them. He believed that, and then he says therefore that was the division that led to this point where you cannot partake the Lord's Supper together. It's impossible. And then in verse 21, for in eating, so he gave the reason, what was the that these brethren were selfish. So they
Mhm.
came and they ate, and without leaving something for the rest to eat. So that's why I think Paul's basically saying that, well, if you're hungry, eat at home. But then do bear in mind that you're coming together to share with others. So fellowship is a sharing, isn't it? It's not about it's not about just taking for yourself, and there's selfishness. I think that when
Exactly.
you read into the context itself, that it seems to suggest that the division was the problem, and that it leads to selfishness rather than fellowship, and therefore that it makes taking a Lord's Supper impossible. I don't want to jump the gun into the next week's lesson itself. That's why that Paul in verse 23 talks about, Paul, I received from the Lord. Paul, again, giving you the reason. He explained why he didn't praise them for the divisive attitude was because that the Lord died for them. So the Lord shared his life with them, and therefore they ought to share their lives with one another. And that's the whole point of the Lord's Supper itself, to remember that, isn't it? To
Well,
remember that the Lord's sacrifice.
and I think that the emphasis it comes out very clearly when you look again. You just go back and look at the text. Verse 17, he talks about coming together, but it's not for the better. Verse 18, when you come together, but then he puts the polar opposite of that, divisions. Verse 19, factions. Verse 20, assemble yourselves together. So he's laying out what should be a purpose of being together, and yet there are these reasons, these divisions, these factions that are prohibiting that. And of course, again, this is the kind of thing that the Corinthians seem to have they've cornered the market on divisions, it seems. That, I mean, by the time we get to chapters 12 through 14, you can imagine Paul wanting to pull his hair out. It's just impossible. Who would want to be an elder in that congregation? I guess would be the question. But let me ask one other thing as we continue with that, and this is some other things that we see in various places around the country that take place during the Lord's Supper. There are congregations that during the serving of the supper, you have people who hum, you have people who different groups singing songs. Uh, Not even getting into the people who are not even thinking about this solemn occasion, but looking and laughing at little babies and stuff like that. But where does this come from, Michael? The idea that during the Lord's Supper we need some additional background music.
The liberalism and emotionalism that we see in the church today. There's no Bible basis for it. Now then, in opposing it, I think our brethren sometimes have made a mistake in saying, well, you cannot do two acts of worship at the same time.
That's a hard argument.
I don't agree with that argument. I don't see any basis for it in reality. The problem with the singing and the Lord's Supper is the nature or the character of the worship. I am to examine myself in partaking of the Lord's Supper. I am in communion with God. If we're singing, we're not doing those things. And the nature of singing and the nature of the Lord's Supper would contradict each other for them doing it at the same time.
Would there be any basis to go and just look at the example of when the supper itself was instituted?
I don't know. I don't. Obviously, here in 1 Corinthians 11 and the latter part of it, when he goes through when the Lord instituted it,
Mm-hmm.
there's nothing in relationship to singing in relationship to the Lord's Supper. You know,
It seemed to have been a very solemn occasion.
yes. it would have been a very solemn occasion. Of course, Jesus instituted it during Passover,
Hmm.
and they were remembering back to those events of the Passover. So that was the purpose of the Passover supper, to remember those events. Would have been a solemn time. When Jesus instituted the supper for the church or for the kingdom, you're thinking about his death. This do in remembrance of me.
Hmm.
That's a solemn occasion. Um,
Also, as Paul writes to the Corinthians, one in if we think of the apostles or those who were there at the time, the disciples, they would of course reflect on not only its institution but the historical context of that institution. The Lord Jesus, the same night in which he was betrayed.
that's not a time for joyousness and it's a time for solemn reflection.
Well, now you're going to get in trouble with John Marr Hicks on that. He views this as a celebration, of course.
Uh, I can't help what that heathen states.
But it is something that when we discuss it, when we preach on that, certainly when we are in the process of that particular act of worship, our minds are to be, as often that we hear in the prayers, focused on the Lord, his death, his resurrection, focused on the purpose for which he came, focused on the blessings that we received, uh, all of which we see the culmination at the cross. And so you don't really want any distractions.
How can someone singing, and if you say humming, that's a problem anyway. That's something that's not authorized by God as far as worship. So let's just keep it in the area of singing. How can someone singing then reflect upon those things properly?
Well, and as you mentioned a few moments ago, when you go back to verse 28, when it says, "But let a man examine himself," and an examination, no matter how you try to define it, requires a singular focus.
I just don't see that those two acts of worship are harmonious when you put them together, doing them at the same time.
Is this something that we see in the church generally, that well, I will say that it's something that I think we always need to give some attention to. I think it will depend on the degree to which it may or may not be a problem. Uh, most every place I've been to worship, any sound congregations, I've never seen any problems during the communion. It's always been dealt with in a very serious manner that has given it due reverence. But it is something that we always need to address generally in a lesson, to speak to it so that we put brethren in remembrance, that we become mindful of it. You would think that the way that it is approached generally, the men at the front, someone reading or quoting scripture, to put the context there for us, would give us the mindset with regard to this, that it is something, as are all acts of worship, very serious. If you don't take the acts of worship seriously, you have to ask what you're doing there. What is the point? What is the purpose? And with hope, Paul is able to get through to these brethren in Corinth. This has been a snowball starting from chapter 1, where Paul has had to address these brethren on so many matters, numerous matters, sometimes 2 and 3 a chapter. When we begin our study next week, which will be in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, the beginning of the discussion of spiritual gifts, we're going to look at just how problematic that was for the Corinthian brethren, and look at that in light of how this might be of some relevance for us today. Since we don't have spiritual gifts, and I'm going to probably, we'll approach it in a number of ways, but since we don't have people with spiritual gifts, what difference does it make to us? So we'll look at that. You know, in other words, what is the contemporaneous relevance of the scriptures in this regard? But we'll talk about that. But looking back at these brethren, it certainly is something that was an obvious challenge to Paul to reach these brethren. You can't make up a congregation that has these number of problems. And I think that the Lord obviously has this here for us as a blueprint of how to deal with a number of congregational issues. It seems tailor-made for any congregation to go through the Corinthian epistle and see how to address leaderships, especially how to address various issues within congregations and between congregations. Because a lot of the things that are here are not only being addressed within the local congregation, but would affect the relationship between congregations, which, in other words, you know, the idea of congregational autonomy, which of course there is, does not allow one congregation to accept sin and expect to continue in fellowship with other congregations. If you have a congregation with a problem like 1 Corinthians 5, and the brethren say, well, this is the problem we have. We have 5 or 6 brethren committing adultery. But that's okay with us. We're going to invite you over for our Friday night singing, or we want you to come over and support our lectureship. Well, it's going to be a problem, a big problem. But this is another area where we see congregations not seemingly understanding this. And I'm still at a loss, Sonny, as to why congregations do not see the seriousness of the fellowship issue. Why is that?
Well, I mean that if brimstone and fire comes up from heaven the moment you sin, I'm sure that people will take notice. Eternal judgment is delayed, as I think that Peter writes there. Scoffers will scoff at it, and I'm sure that people get complacent. You know, I think that if the boss tells you that he's going to pay you 10 years' time for your work, I don't think you bother to work, isn't it? There's no incentive in that sense. You know, I think it's very sad. Yeah, it's true that people do not cannot see the consequences, the ramifications, you know, behind that or beyond that itself. And having said that itself, I think that 1 Corinthians 11:17 presents a quite interesting picture where Paul writes that since you come together not for the better but for the worse, so it seems to suggest that I think this is what a lot of the liberal churches are doing, isn't it? They come together, a physical union, but the spiritual reality behind it is basically it's just not for the better but for the worse.
Well, I think that point is quite well put in that when you are not coming together for the proper purpose, and you certainly are not engaging in the proper actions, and this of course would mean that you're not adhering to teaching in the proper manner, proper way, that you've gone far off the rails. And of course, in too many instances around the world, certainly we see it here in the United States, the church is often adversely influenced by the world, by the culture, by the society in which it finds itself. That, of course, is obvious from Corinth. And I think that we have to be always mindful of that, looking at that. When we were just Wednesday night, we were in 1 Samuel chapter 17, David facing Goliath. And it's almost amazing when you think that here's this little, no, probably not too little, but we'll say little shepherd boy, who is indignant at the very idea of Goliath insulting and blaspheming God. And that he, as a youth, and I say as a youth, he's obviously less than 20 years old. Here, as a youth, he already has the understanding and concept down, where so many of the others around him still can only understand this in terms of some sort of materiality. What was it that offended David? What offended David was Goliath's blasphemies against Israel and his defying of God. What was it that many of the people around around the battlefield were concerned about? Well, what is a king going to give someone who takes on Goliath? He's going to get a lot of money. He's going to marry the king's daughter, and he's not going to have to pay income taxes or taxes. Man, I wish I was really, brave enough to go out there and do that, because that's what I want. But David, his whole mindset was completely different. He was more upset about how offensive this was to righteousness. And I think that's the way that we also should look at things in the world, and not let the external environment affect us as much. Michael, you're going to weigh in a little bit.
I was going to say that the people in the camp of Israel was more concerned with his size than with the realization that God is with them.
They completely forgot God was with it. It's like the 10 spies.
Yeah. It goes back to that physical aspect, though, and instead of looking at the spiritual and toward the spiritual, they look toward the physical.
Well, or that the problems that can be that we have to face in the world are bigger than we are, and how do we manage that? And again, a lack of reliance on God, a lack of faith in God, a lack of belief that God can enable us to overcome. It's a disbelief in the victory. And I think that's kind of what we see in Corinth is a group mindset that is quite denominational. In so many ways, they represent the denominational world, in the absorption of secular ideals and ideas, manifestations. And they take on its idolatries and its covetousness to the highest level. And Paul has no tolerance for that. I see this as one of Paul's angriest, not only angriest epistles, but I think that this particular chapter shows Paul extremely angry with this group of brethren who continue to lack spiritual depth and maturity, but for whom he desires the best. As angry as he is, he still holds out the hope that he can help them, which I think is the lesson that we want to close out with today. Regardless,
before you close, let me ask you one question.
Okay.
Have you ever heard the argument from this section here, specifically about one being hungry and another being drunken, and having houses to eat and drink in, that authorizes drinking of alcoholic beverages?
I have heard that Yes. Um, I have heard that, and I ask people if before they made that thought they had studied Ephesians. Is it
18.
5:18? 5:18. Have you ever looked at that verse? Because if you have, you wouldn't even ask that question.
No, I think whoever argued that point has overlooked the fact that what Paul actually said in that passage in verse 21, 11:21, is that one is hungry and another is drunk. So it authorizes drunkenness at home, not social, not private, just drinking.
That might be answering a fool according to his folly.
Ah,
I mean, you're not authorized to be drunk publicly, but you're authorized to be drunk privately.
that is hilarious. That's funny. I like that.
I do too. I like that one, Study. I
Well,
might have to remember that one for next time I hear the argument.
That's
we
right, yes.
we
Biblical
want
authority for drunkenness at home.
we want to thank you and all who have the opportunity to watch for being with us. We hope that you will join us next week. We will begin with 1 Corinthians chapter 12, the beginning of the discussion of spiritual gifts. And we hope that as we go through these chapters that we will gain much insight from the scriptures, continue to implement those things that we learn into our lives and teaching, and continue to grow in our knowledge of the Lord. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon.